Q&A? Ooh, yes.
Now we'll have some questions from Lucinda, but I want to start with a couple myself, if you don't mind. During those 36 years, what was the most contentious pillow talk you had about a great story he was telling you that you wanted to report, or at least tell to one of your friends to report?
That is very easy. Because after 9/11, Bob came home, smudged with soot, and time stopped. He dealt with it by telling stories of heroic people who had saved people inside the burning building, the collapsing building. And I was stricken and was depressed for days. Then I began to do research into Al-Qaeda and into the connections between the different terrorist groups and the CIA's complicity, inadvertent though it may have been, but it was complicity in 9/11. I wanted to write that story so badly because of all the conspiracy theories that have come after that. I don't think there's any story that's been about the CIA's involvement in the way I portrayed it in 9/11.
Okay. To follow that up, not everybody in the room has spent as much time chasing the Bank of Credit and Commerce International as I have, or Lucinda, or Mr. Morgenthau. I know that one of the reasons the government was so angry or upset about his investigation, and I know this from my own investigation, which I wrote for Forbes, and many other people afterward did this, that the Bank of Credit and Commerce International was used as the main conduit for the CIA, the Saudis, and others to fund the likes of the then unknown Osama bin Laden. So my question is, has Bob since then, or since 9/11, gone through the BCCI records to actually find any money transfers between these various parties that ended up with Osama bin Laden?
Between the CIA?
Or the Saudi government, or whoever. Did they ever reconstruct who was funding Osama bin Laden through BCCI?
The answer is no, because I think it's fairly impossible for one to get CIA records. As for Saudi records, if they exist, they do a lot of things orally.
But
I
there
don't
were
know.
BCCI records that only the New York District Attorney had.
That's true, because the U.S. Attorney, U.S. Attorney's Office could not get BCCI. They could not get their own witnesses. They could not find the evidence that was needed to indict this bank of crooks and criminals, as Bob called it. So Bob had all the records, and the U.S. Attorney's Office came out with indictments after Bob and tried to, take the case away, and they had precedents as far as jurisdiction went. But they didn't indict half of the people that should have been indicted. For instance, the president of the bank, Abedi, who was indicted by Bob, had been taking Jimmy Carter after his presidency had ended, but he'd been taking him around third world countries, introducing him. Jimmy Carter had been introducing Abedi to various leaders, Saudi leaders, Middle Eastern leaders, that would help him in his financial transactions.
Well, you scooped me on my next question, which was, had Bob Morgenthau known as much about Jimmy Carter as he came to know, would he have taken you to the party at Schlesinger's? And I guess you answered the question about why Mr. Abedi's name is inscribed in stone at the Jimmy Carter Memorial Library as a big donor.
Is it? That's great.
But anyway, okay, it's time now to take questions from the crowd. I will start with John Martin, and then maybe he can wander around with the microphone since I know he knows how to use one.
My question was Clark Clifford knowingly complicit in this?
From my understanding, yes. He was. And Bob made a decision, and, you know, it wasn't single-handed. A lot of people were pressuring him to make this decision, not to indict him because of his age and because of his health.
Question coming up.
While John's taking the microphone, I want to say, I was going to save this to the end. In a somewhat unusual departure, our next speaker on November 20th is going to be Robert B. Fisk, the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, who then was the Whitewater Special Prosecutor for a year before he was relieved of his duties, and also was the defense counsel for Clark Clifford and Robert Altman. And quite frankly, I think this should be fascinating. He's going to talk about the press chasing him and what was really going on. And I think that Lucinda and I share a different view of Mr. Clifford's complicity than he will.
That, I would like to come to that lunch.
Thanks. You spoke about your different backgrounds. Did you have to learn how to become a Jewish mother? Was there anything about Judaism or holidays or things like that that you immersed yourself in?
Well, I had pretty much rejected Gentile suburban society where there were no Jews, no African Americans, no people of color, only white people in yellow jackets and red pants. And so I was certainly ready. I actually felt like I was Jewish in a Gentile body because, you know, when I went to college, all my friends were Jewish. My boyfriends were all Jewish. I walked happily into that role. I learned about the Jewish holidays and how to keep a Seder. You know, Bob is one of these people who are not, he was never bar mitzvahed. His father was never bar mitzvahed. He comes from a long line of people who have never been that observant. But he certainly observes Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Passover, and we celebrate those holidays. And I didn't convert. I didn't see any, you know, point in it. But I certainly feel probably more Jewish than Christian.
Sorry.
Please identify yourselves when you ask the question.
Thank you, Lucinda. I'm Mike Eisgrau from the late great WNAW Radio News in New York. Maybe I was under a rock in 2001, but did I hear you say that Bob had in his possession some recordings that connected either Al-Qaeda or one of the terrorist organizations with what happened in 9/11, and it never came out?
Absolutely.
And can you tell us a little more about those recordings and what they contained?
I will tell you a tiny bit. The rest you have to read in the book.
Can I borrow $15 from you? I'm sorry.
The information that he gathered came from a case that he had done. I'll tell you, it was the murder of Meir Kahane, the extremist rabbi from Israel, by a terrorist known as Nosair. The FBI and the CIA had a number of informants that were within Al-Qaeda, within the terrorist organizations, and they wouldn't allow Bob to bring an indictment of conspiracy with the whole terrorist organization being involved in the murder. Instead, the police put out the rumor or statement that it had been a lone gunman. However, the DA's office was the first ones to find these boxes. There were 14 boxes, and they were filled with tapes, all sorts of materials that I won't go into, but really fascinating materials. And they went through them, and then they gave them to the FBI. The FBI never had them translated, or they said they never had them translated. They didn't move on it. And what was in those boxes led to other information that told Bob about the 93 bombings and about an upcoming destruction of the World Trade Center.
That's a story that never got out and should have.
I wanted to put it out, but Bob wouldn't let me.
Mike Candell, formerly of CNN. I'd like to ask you about Bob's relationship with his father. Now, his father was one of FDR's closest associates, was Secretary of the Treasury. His father has been sometimes criticized for the lack of effort by FDR and his administration during the Holocaust. Has Bob ever discussed with you his feelings about his father's role?
He has, and he's discussed it with others, and he's discussed it in front of groups. His father tried very hard to get FDR to lift the quotas, to expand the quotas, to take in Jewish refugees. As for bombing, and finally he did, FDR allowed him to set up the War Refugee Board, which saved many, many thousands of Jews, but too little, too late. The reason the Holocaust camps were not bombed is it would have been a waste of rare material and armament, bombs, planes, whatever, and the concentration camps would have been built up, within a week again. I don't think anybody realizes, and I'm really speaking for Bob now, how much on the edge we were as far as being equipped for World War II. We had given almost all our tanks and planes under the radar before Lend-Lease to England. We couldn't spare any amount of planes or bombs, whatever, to do something that we felt would not bring results.
Lucinda, just a follow-up to that. The State Department during that period was notoriously anti-Semitic. Your, I guess it's your father-in-law, was the Jew boy in the cabinet. Did Bob ever discuss that Henry's relationship with the State Department?
Oh, yes. There were a number of anti-Semitic cabinet members, and in fact, they sabotaged efforts to bring people, namely children, into the United States. There was a citizens group that raised enough money to bring, I can't remember the exact number, but it was more than 1,000 children into the United States, from occupied territories. The State Department sat on the approval until finally Henry Jr., Secretary of the Treasury, found out about it and went to FDR, and by that time, most of the children were dead.
I'll introduce Ralph Blumenthal, New York Times.
My press agent, thank you. Lucinda, with all Bob's achievements, he was not known as a natural politician. Has he ever discussed with you his feelings about running for office? Was it a mistake? And how do you feel about him as a politician?
I think he's done what he wanted to do. Yes, he ran for governor, and I think part of him really wanted to be governor. I think part of him didn't. He wasn't a good campaigner. He's very stiff. This has a lot to do with his PTSD, which I go into in the book, but he couldn't relate to the people as a mass the way he can relate to somebody he trusts and who's a friend one-to-one, which is in a very relaxed and humorous way. He's always loved being DA. He wanted to be DA as long as he possibly could. He retired because he didn't want to be incapacitated in the middle of his term. And of course, here he is, you know, doing all sorts of things. He said he would come home at 4 o'clock every day from the law firm he does pro bono work for, and he comes home at 6:30. And I say, what is this? This is not 6 o'clock, this is 6:30. And he says, this is a half an hour before I came back when I was DA.
You mentioned PSTD. Where does that come from for him?
I'm not going to tell you because it's in the book.
Okay.